To have some examples of actual applications of these expressions in professional settings, as case studies, I'm going to explore some of the projects that I have been working on as animation director, where I have used expressions in various places not only to speed up the workflow, but also to get smooth results and respect the principles of animations. So specifically, I'm going to focus on the shots that are great examples of how we can use sine function, wiggle expression, value at time in practical cases. So I'm going to focus on the first book. I'm going to explore multiple shots of this book, and then I'm going to move on to some more examples from some other books to give you a better understanding of how you can apply these concepts to practical examples. I'm going to start with a simple one. For one of the shots that I wanted to animate these foreground flowers here. So I'm going to focus on only those two elements here. You can see that I'm having two compositions here that contains multiple sets of these flowers here. So I'm going to dive into one of them. If I quickly explore my timeline, you can see that for each one of these flowers, we have one dedicated layer. So they have already been extracted. Since I wanted to get this kind of nice, smooth back and forth swing on these flowers, so definitely I needed to have puppet pins on each one of these flowers. These are my pins. You can see that for each one of these flowers, I have at least 3 or even sometimes 4 pins here. And you can see that none of these puppet pins are having any keyframe on them whatsoever. So everything here is driven by expressions. I'm going to, for example, focus on one of these. I'm having a basic FK setup here. And what I have in terms of animation starts from the base pin. So if I open up the rotation, you can see I'm having a simple expression here, math sine function. This expression is being driven by this master controller, I would call it, that is defining the amplitude as well as the frequency and the offset. This offset is the offset between each one of these flowers. I didn't want them to rotate all together at the same time. So I introduced a master offset between each one of these chains. And that is actually introduced here. So you can see this is my amplitude, this is sine function. Inside that, the time is multiplied by the frequency, and then we are adding some small variation in the time for each one of these flowers. The next pin is only reading the rotation of the previous pin with a delay using the value at time. So that's it. This is just saying that whatever rotation I have on the base pin, it's going to do the same thing with a delay of 0.08 seconds. So everything is now driven by this expression, and you can see if I want to experiment with that, I'm going to play it back so you can see that I'm definitely having a sine function here. And if I want, I can play with the amplitude and play with the frequency, and I can easily change the behavior of this flower swinging. So I'm going to go to my controller and I'm going to increase the frequency to something higher, and I'm going to increase the amplitude to also something higher. So now you can see it's swinging with larger amplitude as well as it's going to swing much faster. So with that, if I see all of these flowers together with the new amplitude, with the new frequency, I'm going to get a totally different look for all of these swings. So I can compare these two sets together. Another example that I want to show you is this shot. So I was dealing with this bus, and as you can guess, it's a perfect place to practice the wiggle expression on the body of the bus. I'm going to solo that, and I'm going to just play it back to see what we have here. So you can definitely see the random wiggle movement on this bus. You can see that on the rotation, I'm having our friend wiggle effect. So wiggle expression being driven by two sliders here. So I have rotation amplitude, rotation frequency, and you can see that I'm reading those values here. Not only I'm able to easily access this expression and experiment with the values, but also I can keyframe these amplitudes. I'm also having another wiggle on the position Y of this layer being controlled by two more sliders here, and I'm able to animate those as well. Here's another shot with the same bus from the front view, so I'm going to dive into that. This is the action I'm getting out of it. So you can see again, the body is having definitely some wiggle expression on it. And not only I have that wiggle expression, I also have some secondary action or overlapping action on the driver as well, which is coming from the value at time. So let's dive into this and see what we have here. This is the bus body. I'm going to open up the rotation, and you can see definitely we have the wiggle expression being driven by one slider here for the frequency and another slider for the amplitude, and that's it. The sliders are sitting on a layer called auto animation, and you can see these are animated. So this way I'm able to keyframe the wiggle expression itself too. So for example, when the bear is entering the bus, I'm increasing the amplitude of my wiggle, and as the bus is idling or moving forward, I'm having a smaller value of the wiggle. And as for the second reaction on the driver, if I dive into the driver composition, this is what I have, a simple FK setup. So I'm going to turn on the pins on it. And again, the beauty of it is that I'm having that value at time to get that nice delay for the rotations. So the original rotation is coming from the base pin. The rotation of the base pin is also being driven by the rotation of the bus itself. So it's reading the composition called bus, which is here. And inside of that, we have a rotation with a delay coming from the body of the bus. So this way, whatever the bus is doing, we're going to get the exact same behavior on this entire chain, all with a delay. If I'm not happy with the amount of wiggle, then I'm going to select the amplitude that I'm using for the bus wiggle, and I'm going to increase that. Now you can see the wiggle is more dramatic. The driver is still reacting to this crazy movement or crazy wiggle on the bus, and I'm not dealing with any keyframes on any of these chains whatsoever. This is another shot that I'm using the sine function to get a nice swing on this rabbit here. So I'm going to focus on the rabbit. So this is the action that I'm getting, and let's explore what I have here. Since I wanted the rabbit to be hanging on this branch, the hierarchy that I defined for this character was actually a non-traditional hierarchy. So in this case, the ears are having their own hierarchy. They are not attached to the body at all. They're actually attached to the tree branch. And you can see I'm having a sine function on it, rotating forward and backward with an amplitude, with a frequency. Then I have this controller here that is the parent of the head of the rabbit. And on that as well, I'm having another sine function. So that's giving me this swing on the entire character. However, the rest of the pins here are having a value at time expression on them. So in this case, you can see that it's reading that controller called head and it's getting some delay on it. And then I'm having the body of the character, which is here. So I have some pins on the body. And now you can see the neck here is a child of the head. The torso is a child of the neck. The root is a child of the torso. This is not a traditional type of hierarchy, but again, since this character is hanging, I wanted to reverse the hierarchy's direction. And for each one of these, I have a rotation expression on them, which is just reading the rotation of their parents with a delay, and that's it. For the character's brushing action, what I have is on the toothbrush, I only have another sine function, which is having a higher frequency on it. That's how it's giving me that nice brushing effect on the toothbrush. I'm going to explore another book that I've animated. This one contains different types of characters and different props. So let's see what we have here. This is one of the shots that I was dealing with multiple characters, and what I wanted to get out of this shot was to have some nice floating effect on this character. So this is the action that I'm getting. You can clearly see the floating effect here on both axes, X and Y, with different frequencies. So I get this random left and right and up and down movement on the entire character. For the arms, you might notice that I might have a wiggle expression, and you can clearly see the value at time effect for multiple places here to give me this nice overlapping action for the entire movement. So I'm going to dive into the male character. In this case, I wanted the rope to also be a little bit smooth, so I decided to have some pins on it. These are the pins that I have here, a simple FK hierarchy here. As for the rotations expressions, I have a sine function on one of the pins. I have another sine function on the other one with some delay with different frequencies to get that random rotation on them. As for the character's body, the root is parented to the first pin of the rope. The chest is a child of the root. The neck is a child of the chest. So it's a traditional hierarchy. I'm going to open up the position expression of the second pin of the rope, and you can see that I'm having some expressions on the position here. So that's causing it to go up and down. I have some expressions on the first pin of this rope. that is driving both the rotation and X and Y positions. All sine functions, though for each one of them I'm having different frequencies, some delays for each one of them, different amplitudes to create that kind of random path for this character's body. The arms are having again the same deal. The hand is following the elbow with a delay, the elbow is following the arm with a delay, and the arm or the shoulder is having its own wiggle as well as a sine function. I wanted to get some swing on it, but at the same time I wanted to have some random rotation on it as well. Still, we have this value at time for the entire chain of the arm to get that bending effect on the elbows. For the legs, I'm having a wiggle and a sine function driving the hip, and the rest of the chain is reading the rotation of the hip just with a delay. So that gives me that nice swing and floating effect on the entire body here. And of course, since these are expressions, if I want to make them more subtle or exaggerate the actions, I can definitely change these values. So for example, I can change the amplitude here to 20, and we're going to see how it's going to change the behavior of the leg. You can see the character's right leg is now swinging with higher amplitude. I can do the same thing for the entire up and down movement of the entire body. So I'm going to increase the amplitudes. Another example of how we can procedurally animate multiple characters all together without using keyframes is this case. So I'm going to only focus on the snakes here because that's a perfect example of how we can speed up animating a bunch of characters without dealing with keyframes whatsoever. So certainly we are having some random movement on these snakes. The tongues are also having some swings effect on them. So you can clearly see the effect of wiggle expression as well as the sine function. So I'm going to dive into this composition and see what we have here. So this is one of the snakes here. And you can see for each one of these pins this time, rather than having expressions on the rotations, I decided to go with position because I wanted to get that nice stretch and compress effect on the body of the snake. This is what we expect to see. And you can see that I'm having a wiggle expression for all of these pins. And that gives me that random up and down for each single one of these pins. And that creates that nice stretch and compress effect on the body of the snake. For the tongues though, I'm having multiple pins here, and the reason why I made them inside a composition was to be able to use this composition for all of those snakes. You can see for these pins, I'm having the same kind of deal that is reading the rotation of their previous parent with a delay using the value at time, and the rest of these expressions or sliders are actually helping me to create variations for each one of these tongues. So when I'm looking at them all together, they are not going to swing at the same time. The base pin itself is having a sine function, so this is the way I can actually get that nice swing effect on the tongue. The other book that I want to explore here is Never Play Music Next to the Zoo. So I'm starting with one of these shots here. So in this shot, I was dealing with multiple characters that I wanted to avoid animating them using keyframes. So again, another example of using expressions. I'm going to focus on a couple of these. So it's a typical human character setup. I have IK setup for the legs. I have IK setup for one of these arms, a simple FK chain for the upper body and FK chain for the tail. What I decided to do was to drive the entire action using the root controller. So I'm having expressions on the root, simple wiggle expression. The rest of it is coming from the value at time. So every single part of this rig is being driven by its parent, reading its rotations and giving it a delay. So that's for the upper body. For the tail, I have similar setup. Tail's base pin is reading the root's rotation with a delay, and the rest of the pins on the tail are actually having a delay from their parents, and that is actually helping me to drive the entire setup. The IK hand controller in this case is parented to this instrument, so regardless of the rotation that this instrument is getting, this hand is always attached to it, and that results into this bend effect on the arm. On the root itself, not only I have rotation expressions, but also I have positional expressions. So again, the character's body goes up and down, and all of these are through wiggle expressions. Since everything here is being driven by expressions, I can simply experiment with different values and change the behavior of these actions. I can come here and increase their amplitudes to something larger, and you're going to see the actions are going to be more dramatic. If I want, I can also increase the positional wiggle as well. And clearly I'm breaking the rig because of the exaggerated values that I chose for these wiggles, but I just wanted to show you how far we can go with these expressions. I can dial it down, I can make it less wiggly. So I'm going to change the rotational amplitude to something very low, and you're going to see now the actions are going to be very, very slow. And finally, another example here, and in this case I also was dealing with several characters that I wanted to avoid animating them using keyframes, so this was a perfect place that I could actually animate them using expressions. I'm going to start with this background character here, so I'm going to dive into that one. So you can clearly see the effect of sine function and wiggle expression here. Let's explore what we have here. I'm going to start with the lion. I'm having a traditional FK setup for the upper body. So in order to see what expressions I have here, the first pin of the spine is having the wiggle expression on it. The second one is having the rotation values coming from the first pin with a delay. And then as for the character, I'm having an IK setup for the right leg and an FK setup for the left leg. And the entire upper body of the character is a simple FK chain. So I can check what I have for the male character here. So simple IK setup here, and on the root I have rotational as well as positional expression to derive each one of these attributes using a wiggle expression. And for the positional value, it's actually reading the tiptoe attribute of the foot IK controller. So on this one, I'm driving the tiptoe attribute using a wiggle expression, and that is actually driving the positional Y value of the root as well. So when the character is tiptoeing up and down, the body is reacting to that. And for the rest of the hierarchy, for each one of the pins, I'm reading the rotation value of their parents, and I'm just giving them a delay. Another place that I used a lot of expressions was on this lady. So let's dive into that lady composition and see what we have there. So clearly a lot of sine functions here, but the point here is that I wanted to get some random sine function for each one of these raccoons here to get this nice random crowd effect on this entire composition. The first thing that I want to start with is for the lady. Of course, since this lady's legs are not on the ground, I didn't go with any kind of IK setup for either the arms or the legs. So everything is simple FK setup, and you can clearly see the value at time effect here. So each one of these pins are reading the rotation of their parents with a value at time expression to give that a delay. As for the animation, it actually is coming from the root. So I'm going to now open up the root controller, and you can see that I'm only having a simple sine function driving it, and the rest of it is all driven by just value at time expression reading their parents. So that's for the lady. For the raccoons though, I do have IK for each one of these arms because I wanted to have the elbows to actually bend backward and forward. The raccoon's arms are actually set up in IK. However, the IK controller for each one of these hands are parented to a closest pin of the lady. So for example, this IK here is parented to this pin of the body. This one is parented to this hand pin of the lady, and so on. So the hands of the raccoons are attached to the body of the lady. However, for their own bodies, I have a simple FK setup here. So for example, this middle one, you can see that its rotation is still again reading the rotation of its parent with a delay. For the root itself, I'm having an independent expression on each one of these. So for the rotation, I'm having an individual sine function with a frequency of 11, for example. For the positional value, I'm having a sine function again, and for position X, I am also having another sine function. So it goes up and down, it goes left and right, it bends forward and backward. But since the hands are attached to the body of the lady, we see that kind of nice bend effect on the elbows. And for each one of these raccoons, I'm having different frequencies and different offsets, and that gives me an independent action on each one of these raccoons. So not all the actions are happening at the same time. So this way, it gives me this nice result here. And again, no keyframe whatsoever in this composition. I'm hitting U on my keyboard, and the only keyframes that I'm seeing here is just on the eyes and the mouth shapes. And there is no more keyframe on any other places. So again, the beauty of it is that since everything here is driven by this root controller, I can find it and I can exaggerate the actions on it. So I'm going to have the rotation to be a little bit more exaggerated, and it's going to break the rig, but let's see what we get. Yeah, definitely the rotation value is too exaggerated, but you can see that everything is being driven by those expressions. Just for the sake of experimenting with these amplitudes, I'm going to reduce the amplitude to something very low, both for the positional value as well as the rotation. So now it's going to be a very subtle action on the body of the lady. The raccoons have their own sign function and their own wiggle expression. So if I want to make it a little bit more subtle, I need to go in for each one of these 4 raccoons and change their values. Just imagine doing it through keyframes. It would be impossible to manage all of these or experiment with different values for each one of these rotations or positions values. So when the animation on this composition is done, the only thing that is left is just having this entire composition to only go from left to right. So I'm only having 2 keyframes here on the X position to go from left to right, and everything else is happening inside that composition.